On a storm-thinned night in Rome, lightning split the sky over St. Peter's Basilica. The flash was as dramatic as any symbol the city could offer, a momentary illumination of a church that had spent centuries cloaked in layers of ritual and secrecy. When the Pope, an office that had once seemed timeless, announced he would step down, the world felt the shock like thunder. That resignation did not arrive in a vacuum. It was the punctuation mark on a story that had been building through decades: political bargains, financial shadows, moral crises, and secrets kept behind closed doors. This is the tale that moves from John Paul II's Cold War stage to the reformist battle of Francis, a story of power, of hidden accounts, of leaks that tore at the Vatican's opaque heart. If you're interested in long-form investigations into history, power, and hidden institutions, consider subscribing for more stories like this. The Vatican we encounter in the 20th century is at once ancient and newly sovereign. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 recast the papacy, once a temporal power, now a tiny independent state with diplomatic ambitions and a seat at the table of nations. For the popes who followed Pius XI, that bargain offered protection and influence, but it also presented temptations and dilemmas. Pius XI accepted a deal with Mussolini that secured the church's juridical status in Italy. That bargain bought the Vatican a measure of safety, but also tied it, uneasily, to a regime whose brutality and ideology raised moral alarms across Europe. Historians note the complexity. The Holy See sought to preserve Catholic institutions and clergy, while later critics asked whether that preservation came at the cost of moral clarity. As one Vatican historian observes, the Lateran Accord transformed the papacy from a largely spiritual authority into an actor that had to navigate the gauntlet of 20th century politics. When war swept the continent, Pius XII inherited that legacy. His defenders argue that he worked quietly behind the scenes to save lives. His critics suggest moral failings in public silence. The debate over his wartime role became one of the century's most bitter controversies about institutional responsibility. Scholars like David I. Kurtzer have insisted that historical judgments must be grounded in archives and evidence, yet the sealed nature of many Vatican records has left room for contestation. Whether one concludes that Pius XII was a diplomat constrained by perilous circumstances or a moral voice that spoke too softly, the episode foreshadowed a recurring pattern. The Church, acting to protect itself, sometimes blurred the lines between prudence and compromise. Out of the ruins of war came Vatican II, convoked by John XXIII and carried forward under Paul VI. It was supposed to be a breath of fresh air, liturgical renewal, engagement with the modern world, a pastoral turn away from fortress theology.
The Council's language often aimed to open windows where previously there had been shutters. For many clergy and faithful, it felt like liberation. For others entrenched in curial practices, it looked like a threat to order and authority. A fierce conservative backlash coalesced. Cardinals and bureaucrats who had long run the Church's administrative machinery reacted with suspicion to proposals that would democratize decision-making or adapt centuries-old rituals to modern sensibilities. Among the prominent counter-voices was Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who warned that reforms could erode doctrinal certainty. Joseph Ratzinger, then a theologian, later prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and ultimately Benedict XVI, emerged as a critical voice in that debate. He argued for doctrinal clarity even as he recognized the need for reform, a tension that would mark his later papacy. That tension between reformist impulse and conservative defense helped shape the Vatican's internal culture for decades. It is a key to understanding how secrets could take root. When power is concentrated and accountability diffused, the temptation to shield uncomfortable truths becomes institutionalized. The Curia, the Vatican's administrative heart, grew into a fortress of protocol, privilege, and intricate networks of patronage. It was not a single conspiracy, so much as a set of practices that rewarded loyalty and discretion. This kind of deep, evidence-based analysis is what we focus on here. If that perspective matters to you, subscribing helps you stay with the investigation. If one axis of Vatican power was bureaucratic, another, and perhaps more consequential for the scandals that followed, was financial. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione, better known as the Vatican Bank, or IOR, sat at the center of a growing maze. Conceived to serve the Church's pastoral missions, by the mid-20th century, it had become a repository for clandestine funds, diplomatic slush, and assets that required discretion. The IOR's special status, shielded by Vatican sovereignty, made it attractive to those seeking secrecy. In the archives of investigative journalism and court records, names begin to recur like leitmotifs. Paul Marcinskis, an American prelate who rose to power in Rome and came to represent the Vatican's sometimes cavalier approach to finance. Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi, financiers whose dealings intertwined banking, mafia networks, and the church in ways that would later spawn courtroom battles and conspiracy theories. Journalists and authors such as Gianluigi Nuzzi and David Yalop documented tangled threats, loans, offshore accounts, covert transfers.
According to investigative reports and court findings in Italy, both Sindona and Calvi had links to criminal networks and used financial vehicles that crossed national borders, transactions that sometimes brushed against Vatican institutions or involved intermediaries who cultivated ties within the church. It is crucial to say from the start, allegations in these cases are layered. Many claims were subjects of trials, some produced convictions in secular courts, others remained unresolved, and the Vatican's own legal sovereignty complicated investigations. Still, the pattern of opaque banking and murky associations eroded public trust. The Vatican Bank's status as both a spiritual steward and a juridical exception created a paradox. The very independence that protected the papacy also hindered external oversight. A figure like Paul Marcinskis came to personify that paradox. As head of the Vatican's financial operations in the late 20th century, he exercised influence far beyond what his clerical rank would suggest. He defended the IOR's autonomy as necessary for the Church's mission. Critics accused him of operating with impunity. Public scandals, most famously the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano in the early 1980s and the death of Roberto Calvi, found hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London, thrust Vatican finances into the international spotlight. British and Italian inquiries probed connections between Calvi's bank, mafia money, and clandestine accounts. Some investigative accounts argued that the Vatican's institutional opacity had created an environment where illicit funds could be parked or laundered. Others countered that the Holy See was a victim of criminal manipulators who used church structures for illicit ends. The consequences rippled beyond the balance sheets. When financial dealings entangled the church with elements of the criminal world, the moral authority of the papacy suffered. For many believers and secular observers alike, the same institution preaching charity and moral teaching now faced accusations of tolerating murky practices. That dissonance would later make revelations about sexual abuse and institutional cover-ups all the more devastating. When an institution's integrity is eroded on one front, its credibility to act decisively on another can be compromised. Into this pre-existing landscape stepped Karol Wojtyla, elected in 1978 as Pope John Paul II. The Polish cardinal brought to the papacy a pastoral charisma and a geopolitical perspective born of life under Soviet domination. He became the first Slavic pope in centuries, and his election signaled a shift in the Vatican's global footprint. John Paul II saw the papacy as both pastoral and prophetic. He would travel widely, speak forcefully on the world stage, and use the moral weight of the church to challenge ideologies he believed oppressed human dignity.
One of the most consequential aspects of his pontificate was the role he played in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. His 1979 pilgrimage to Poland sparked mass public embraces of faith in public life. Historians largely agree that his presence and rhetoric galvanized opposition movements, and none more emblematic than Solidarność, the Polish trade union movement that challenged the communist regime. Scholars have documented the solidarity between the Polish church and dissident movements. Some archival sources and later investigative accounts suggest that the Vatican's support for anti-communist movements included not only moral encouragement but also financial assistance, sometimes routed in ways meant to be discreet. Whether certain funds passed through back channels and the degree to which intelligence services from Western governments were involved remains a matter of contested scholarship. Some historians and journalists have pointed to declassified documents and testimonies that indicate collaboration between religious actors and Western intelligence during the Cold War, particularly where weakening Soviet control was a strategic objective. Yet it is important to stress nuance. Historical evidence varies in reliability, and the Vatican's own confidentiality complicates reconstruction. Where researchers have argued for clandestine monetary support to Solidarność, they typically frame it as part of a patchwork of Western and religious backing that contributed to the movement's resilience. Others warn against simplistic narratives that turn the church into a Cold War puppet, insisting that the pastoral motive and the political outcomes must be judged separately. The papacy's geopolitical activism also exposed it to risk.
On May 13, 1981, an assassin's gunfire struck John Paul II in St. Peter's Square, a moment that shocked the world and set off immediate speculation. The shooter, Mehmet Ali Agca, later claimed different motivations and affiliations in various testimonies. Some of those claims suggested conspiratorial involvement by foreign intelligence agencies. Others pointed to extremist movements. Official inquiries in Italy and elsewhere explored whether Agca had accomplices and what networks might have been involved. The mystery deepened when Agca, years later, suggested broader conspiracies. Some commentators found such lines of inquiry plausible, others regarded them as speculative or self-serving. What remains indisputable is the effect on the Vatican. An attempted assassination on a pope who had become both a spiritual leader and a geopolitical symbol intensified fears about the intersection of sacred authority and worldly power. While John Paul II was strengthening the Church's global voice, backroom arrangements in Rome continued to shape events. The 1980s became a decade of crises that exposed the Vatican's vulnerabilities.
The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, the obscure deaths of financiers, and the exposure of murky transfers. These episodes undermined confidence in the Church's financial stewardship. Investigations led to arrests in Italy and sensational reporting in international media. Books and documentaries chronicled the tangled web that linked banks, secret societies, and alleged mafiosi to high finance, and occasionally to institutions like the IOR. Journalists such as Gianluigi Nuzzi later chronicled parallel stories inside the Vatican, memoirs and leaked documents that would feed public curiosity and outrage. These investigations emphasized how certain Vatican offices had become central nodes in networks where secrecy was currency and accountability thin. It was a pattern that combined human fallibility with institutional structures that prioritized discretion over transparency. Outside the banking scandals, a quieter but equally damning crisis was emerging: allegations of clerical sexual abuse and institutional cover-up. Reports from the United States, Ireland, and other countries into the 2000s. Victims and their advocates told stories of abuse, followed by denial or obfuscation within diocesan and Vatican structures. As cases multiplied and settlements grew, the Catholic Church faced one of the most painful reckonings in its modern history. Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, occupied a complex position in this unfolding drama. As a young theologian, he had been part of debates over Vatican II. Later, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he oversaw doctrinal and disciplinary matters, including clergy abuses. Those who followed his career noted his efforts to centralize certain disciplinary mechanisms. Yet when he became pope, the institutional weight he sought to lift was heavier than any single reform plan could easily shift. Reports indicate that Ratzinger attempted to address abuse and financial opacity, but his efforts collided with entrenched interests and the Vatican's unique legal environment. When internal documents began to leak in the early 2000s, the public caught a glimpse of infighting and frustration inside the papal household. VatiLeaks, an episode that saw confidential documents released to the press, exposed accusations of corruption, infighting, and mismanagement. Paolo Gabriele, a papal butler, was arrested and later convicted in Vatican court for the theft of documents he handed to journalists. His actions, and the subsequent reporting by figures such as Gianluigi Nuzzi, revealed a bureaucracy in crisis, mistrust within the Holy See, networks of influence, and financial dealings that many officials felt needed reform. That leak struck at the heart of the Vatican's illusion of control.
The spectacle of a trial in the tiny Vatican courts, the publication of memos alleging venality and incompetence, and the international press coverage produced a new reality. The papacy was no longer safely insulated from scrutiny. The Pope's private world had become public property. Stories like this don't end in one episode. If you want to follow how these crises unfold across time, consider subscribing to the channel. For Benedict, the crisis magnified the limits of reform. Sources within the Vatican reported a growing sense of isolation. The public image of the papacy, already strained by financial scandals and abuse revelations, suffered further as secret memos and accusations circulated. Then came the announcement that would stun Rome and the world: a pope voluntarily resigning, the first to do so in nearly 6 centuries. The lightning that had split the night sky over St. Peter's felt like an apt emblem of an era in which the institution was forced to confront its vulnerabilities. This is where the narrative must pause and ask what leads an ancient religious office to such dramatic choices. The resignation was a symptom of deeper institutional ailments: unchecked networks of patronage, financial structures that invited abuse, and a bureaucratic culture resistant to transparency. Those ailments were not born overnight. They grew from decisions made in moments of crisis, choices to protect the Church's prerogatives, to maintain sovereignty, or to respond to geopolitical threats that had long-term costs. Yet the story does not end with resignation. Out of the Vatican storms arose a new figure, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, elected Pope Francis in 2013. His election represented a sharp rhetorical and symbolic break, a Latin American Jesuit who placed the margins at the center of his papacy. His emphasis on the poor, migrants, and pastoral simplicity contrasted with the image of an entrenched curia and secretive finance. By creating a council of cardinals to advise him and pushing for financial reform, Francis directly challenged vested interests. But reform, in any ancient institution, encounters resistance. The Vatican's internal alliances and legal anomalies make change especially difficult. To understand why reform has been so fraught, it helps to return to the mechanics of secrecy and to the personalities who became guardians of the old order. Figures like Marcinkus, whose tenure in Vatican financial operations left a complex legacy, embodied a style of leadership that privileged discretion and loyalty. Those who succeeded him operated within networks that often blurred the line between pastoral stewardship and private influence. When investigations touched these networks, the response ranged from defensive silence to legal maneuvers asserting Vatican sovereignty. Alongside institutional guardianship, the Cold War left another legacy: the Church's diplomatic entanglements with state actors.
John Paul II's fight against communism earned the Vatican gratitude and enemies. It also pushed the Holy See into the world of intelligence and realpolitik. Scholars and former officials have documented instances where religious motivations aligned with statecraft, sometimes in ways that blurred ethical boundaries. Whether those alignments constituted necessary defense or problematic compromise has remained hotly contested. Throughout this narrative, two themes keep returning: secrecy as a survival strategy and secrecy as a liability. The Vatican developed tools to protect its mission in a hostile world, from diplomatic immunity to discreet financial channels. But the same tools that preserved independence also shielded misconduct. When whistleblowers or journalists pierced those defenses, the revelations did not merely embarrass, they undermined an institution whose moral authority depends on credibility. As this first sweep of the story reaches into the early years of the 21st century, the layers begin to multiply. Financial scandals, Cold War geopolitics, doctrinal conflict, and the sexual abuse crisis converge. Figures who once seemed untouchable, bankers, cardinals, bureaucrats, found themselves the subjects of trials, leaks, and public outrage. The papacy itself, which had long relied on mystique and authority, found both diminished and transformed. When the Vatican's own butler became a whistleblower, when former financiers were found dead in mysterious circumstances, when a pope faced gunfire in St. Peter's Square, each episode added to a pattern of vulnerability. But these shocks also opened spaces for reformers who saw the moment as an opportunity. The question that followed, and that still hangs over the Church, is whether these reforms can alter structures as ancient as the papacy itself, or whether the weight of history, privilege, and secrecy will reassert itself. We reach a crossroads whose turning point is human as much as institutional. Personal loyalties, theological convictions, geopolitical imperatives, and financial interests all collided in ways that left scars on the Church's reputation. The next chapters of this story would show how these threads tightened into crises that forced popes to choose: to defend the institution as configured, or to risk confrontation with powerful internal interests in order to reform it. If you want to see how these tensions played out in the lives of key figures and in courtroom dramas that crossed national borders, stay with this investigation. There are archival memos, trial transcripts, and eyewitness accounts that reveal how secrecy was kept and how it was broken. If this deep dive is what you're looking for, subscribe now and watch the full documentary for the documents and testimonies that lay bare these hidden corridors.
The threads picked up here converge on a handful of defining episodes that exposed the Vatican's vulnerabilities. The spiraling bank scandals of the 1970s and 1980s, the assassination attempt that transformed a pope into a Cold War icon, the growing chorus of abuse allegations from around the globe, and the leaks that showed how remedial measures could be sabotaged from within. Each episode deserves close scrutiny, because together they explained why a papacy once perceived as untouchable could be rocked so profoundly.
Consider the Banco Ambrosiano affair and the death of Roberto Calvi. Calvi's bank collapsed under the weight of bad loans and covert dealings. When his body was found in London, speculation about mafia involvement and secret society surged. Journalistic investigations and court proceedings in Italy explored links between Calvi's operations and shadowy financial conduits that sometimes intersected with the Vatican's interests. David Yallop's investigative book and subsequent reporting suggested improper connections, while Italian prosecutors pursued criminal inquiries. These events illustrated how international finance, criminal networks, and clerical entities could entangle in ways that the Church had not anticipated and could not easily control. Meanwhile, the figure of Michela Sindona embodied a different but related strand, a financier whose legal convictions and alleged mafia ties showed how secular criminal actors could use ecclesial structures for illicit ends. Sindona's trials and convictions in the 1980s, alongside banking collapses, created a public sense of scandal that reached beyond Rome's walls. Where the Church's discretion once protected it from scrutiny, in these moments it became a source of suspicion. And yet institutional inertia persisted. Many inside the Roman bureaucratic ecosystem insisted that secrecy was necessary for protecting donors, for diplomacy, for theological reasons. Those who challenged that assumption, be they reform-minded cardinals, external investigators, or courageous whistleblowers, often met resistance. The Vatican's unique legal status complicated accountability. Sovereign immunity could shield activities from external investigators, while internal courts had limited reach and faced their own conflicts of interest. Into this fraught mix stepped actors who would shape the Vatican's public posture for decades, theologians who argued for a reassertion of doctrinal clarity, cardinals who defended traditional prerogatives, and 20th century popes whose different emphases created alternating waves of reform and retrenchment. John Paul II's geopolitical activism, Benedict's doctrinal and disciplinary attempts, and Francis's pastoral and institutional reforms can only be understood against this backdrop of financial opacity and political entanglement.
As the narrative moves forward, it will examine how specific decisions, who controlled bank accounts, who appointed which officials, who vetoed which reforms, had consequences that reverberated across continents. It will trace how secrecy was both weapon and defense, and how leaks and trials transformed private rubrics into public scandals. It will also return to the intimate human costs, the victims of abuse whose voices were for years marginalized, the faithful who felt betrayed, and the clerics who tried to navigate a damaged institution. The next segment will dive deeply into the IOR's inner workings, the men who ran it, and the judicial inquiries that tried, and sometimes failed, to hold them to account. It will follow court transcripts, diplomatic cables, and testimony from former officials to map how money flowed and why it mattered. It will juxtapose archival documents with interviews from historians and canon law experts who have traced the legal and moral implications. But before we descend into the vaults where ledgers met loyalty, pause with the image that started this tale, lightning over St. Peter's. It's a fitting symbol. Light can expose what lies hidden. Thunder can startle the complacent. The storms that rocked the Vatican were not merely atmospheric, they were institutional. They rewrote expectations about transparency, accountability, and the costs of secrecy. The question that now presses on the Church, and that presses on any institution that concentrates spiritual authority and worldly power, is whether illumination leads to reform or to a new cycle of concealment. What follows is an excavation of those vaults, an inventory of documents, and a mapping of the networks that brought a global religious institution into the crosshairs of secular justice and public scrutiny. We will examine the personalities who commanded influence behind the scenes, the trials that exposed financial links to criminal actors, and the contested decisions that fed a growing crisis of credibility. We will listen to historians who have sifted archives, to journalists who risked careers to publish leaks, and to canon law scholars who trace the limits of Vatican jurisdiction. One expert who has examined the Vatican's diplomatic choices during the Cold War notes that the Holy See was not simply responding to events, it was shaping them. Another scholar, specializing in ecclesiastical finance, emphasizes that the IOR's peculiar legal status made transparency inherently difficult. Both voices underscore a shared point. The dilemmas the Vatican faced were structural as well as personal. These are the double strands we will untangle next: how institutions created spaces for secrecy, and how individuals exploited those spaces with consequences that reached far beyond Rome. We will begin that search in the late 1960s. The decade that saw the Vatican reposition itself politically and financially in a world of new superpowers and shadow economies, tracing how old ecclesiastical practices meshed with modern banking innovations. That era shows how a church trying to shepherd a global flock inadvertently created channels that could be misused by both allies and enemies. It is a story of policy and personality, of doctrine and ledger, and of a faith institution compelled to confront the realities of modern power. We begin the descent into the vaults where faith met finance, the late 1960s and 1970s, an era of rapid modernization in global banking and of an equally rapid expansion of the Vatican's diplomatic reach. In boardrooms and chancelleries, long-standing ecclesiastical practices collided with contemporary financial instruments. The result was neither inevitable nor singularly malicious, yet it produced opportunities for both principled stewardship and dangerous abuse. At the center of this story sat the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican Bank. Its mandate, as conceived, was narrow: manage assets destined for charitable works, provide banking services to Vatican employees and religious orders, and protect funds needed for sensitive diplomatic work. But the IOR's legal status, outside normal national banking regulations and shielded by the Holy See's sovereignty, made it an attractive place for funds that required discretion. Over time, discretion grew into opacity. Those who operated in that opacity often defended it as necessary. They argued that the church had to protect vulnerable institutions, finance missionaries in hostile territories, and conduct diplomacy that sometimes required confidentiality. Yet the very mechanisms that enabled those protections also permitted the concealment of questionable transactions. Men who controlled access to accounts acquired power disproportionate to their rank. Among them was a figure whose name became shorthand for the Vatican's financial age, Paul Marcinkus. Marcinkus, an American archbishop who rose to oversee key financial operations, embodied the paradox of clerical guardianship and managerial autonomy. Supporters said his management style reflected tough decisions in difficult times. Critics argued that under his watch, the Vatican's banking structures became entangled with risky private interests. Journalists and historians have described Marcinkus as the man who kept the engines running, even when the engines sputtered. He insisted that certain practices were necessary for the church's mission. His detractors saw a culture that tolerated, if not enabled, impropriety. This is where the threads touch international crime and the murky world of high finance. Two names, repeatedly mentioned in investigative reports and courtroom records, help illustrate the mixture of legitimate banking with illicit networks: Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi.
Sindona was a financier with deep ties to Italian politics and organized crime, who later faced multiple convictions. Calvi was a banker whose Banco Ambriosano collapsed spectacularly in 1982, leaving creditors ruined and the global press scandalized. Their stories are often told alongside the Vatican's because both men used layers of offshore entities and opaque intermediaries, tools that, in some cases, intersected with Vatican-controlled accounts or ecclesiastical networks. Court documents and investigative journalism traced loans, guarantees, and transfers across borders. In one pattern investigators identified, private banks extended credit secured by letters of patronage or by institutions that feigned ecclesiastical backing. In other cases, intermediaries with ties to religious entities acted as conduits. Such arrangements could be legitimate, especially when pastoral missions require untraceable support, but they could also be exploited by those seeking to disguise the origin of funds. The collapse of Banco Ambriosano and the death of Roberto Calvi became defining moments. Calvi was discovered in London in June 1982, and the circumstances of his death, initially ruled suicide, later treated by some courts as homicide, spurred sensational coverage and prolonged investigations. Italian prosecutors explored links between the bank's failures, mafia infiltration, secret societies, and alleged irregularities involving Vatican-linked entities. Over the years, inquiries produced a mosaic of findings: improper loans, hidden liabilities, and financial relationships that crossed ethical lines. Yet the layers of sovereign privilege, the technicalities of international law, and the murk of offshore finance meant that definitive legal closure proved elusive in many respects. Investigative accounts argue that the Vatican's sovereign status complicated and sometimes impeded full forensic accounting. Vatican spokespeople and some historians countered that the Holy See had been the victim of crafty manipulators. Michele Sindona's trajectory added another dimension. Convicted of fraud and other crimes in secular courts, Sindona's dealings, his use of banks, shell companies, and high-level contacts showed how financial criminals could weave themselves into institutions that prize confidentiality.
In one notorious episode, Sindona was convicted in the United States and later served sentences related to financial fraud. He died in prison in mysterious circumstances that only added to the narrative's dark hue. Court records, media reporting, and later historical studies documented these events. Again, the shared lesson was structural. Opaque systems invite exploitation. These financial scandals did not occur in isolation. They circulated within a broader culture of discretion in Rome, where personal loyalties and diplomatic needs shaped decisions.
The Curia's insular networks, religious orders, lay collaborators, intermediaries in finance, created a human architecture that could protect, but also conceal. The more the Vatican guarded its privacy, the greater the temptation for outsiders to find exploitative openings. As the 1980s unfolded, another threat intensified: the Vatican's geopolitical posture under John Paul II. His papacy was transformational in global terms. John Paul II took the papal office beyond liturgical reform and pastoral outreach, into the realm of high-stakes geopolitics. His Polish identity and personal history under communism gave him a unique moral authority in Eastern Europe. The Vatican's relationship with Solidarność, moral, practical, and, according to some accounts, financial, became a focal point in discussions of how the Church engaged state power. Scholars have documented a multi-layered relationship: pastoral support, clandestine communications, and possibly monetary aid routed through discrete channels. Declassified documents from Western state archives, alongside memoirs and investigative reporting, indicate that various Western governments, intelligence agencies, and non-state actors sometimes coordinated with religious movements against communist regimes. Historians caution against monotone conclusions. Religious motives, geopolitical strategy, and local agency all played roles. Nevertheless, some researchers, drawing on diplomatic cables and interviews, have argued that funding and logistical assistance, whether direct or indirect, helped sustain dissident movements. They stress, however, that the Vatican's engagement was rarely a simple matter of covert sponsorship. It was also an exercise in symbolic solidarity that energized public opposition to authoritarian regimes. The intersection of faith and geopolitics made the papacy both influential and vulnerable. John Paul II's bold internationalism raised his profile and his enemies. The 1981 assassination attempt in St. Peter's Square focused global attention on the dangers faced by a pope who had become a political symbol. Mehmet Ali Agca's shooting of the pope produced layers of speculation. Was it the work of an isolated extremist, the product of transnational radicals, part of a wider conspiracy? Official investigations in Italy and elsewhere pursued leads, but the complexity of Agca's own statements and the tangled international context ensured that many questions remained disputed. Still, the attack crystallized a new reality. The papacy's moral authority could translate into geopolitical influence, and influence could make the papacy a target. The same decades that amplified the Vatican's global voice also revealed its domestic vulnerabilities. Allegations of financial misconduct and the exposure of secretive banking practices eroded public trust. In parallel, a slow, painful process of revelation about clerical sexual abuse began to surface with increasing force.
Victims, advocates, and investigative journalists brought forward stories of abuse and of institutional responses that prioritized reputation over justice. In the United States, Ireland, Australia, and elsewhere, inquiries and reports, some formal and some journalistic, began to establish patterns of cover-up, reassignment of accused priests, and opaque disciplinary processes. Important benchmarks in this reckoning included national investigations, such as the Murphy Report in Ireland, and inquiries in multiple U.S. dioceses, whose public hearings and released documents exposed a systematic mishandling of abuse allegations. These reports detailed priests' offenses, diocesan transfers, and internal memos that suggested an inclination to resolve problems quietly rather than transparently. Victims' testimonies, relayed in courts, commissions, and media, invited moral and legal questions about accountability at every level of ecclesiastical administration. Internally, the Vatican's responses were uneven. Some officials moved toward stricter disciplinary measures and toward recognizing victims' rights. Others defended established practices, arguing that local bishops needed discretion to maintain pastoral order. Joseph Ratzinger, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for many years before becoming pope, grappled with the need to centralize certain disciplinary tools. He pursued the reform of canonical procedures to make handling allegations more consistent and to facilitate cooperation with secular authorities. But the deeply rooted culture of institutional protection, jurisdictional ambiguity, and in some cases personal loyalties slowed progress. By the time Benedict XVI emerged as pope, the world's patience had frayed. He inherited not only decades of unresolved scandals, but also the perception that the Vatican's internal mechanisms had failed victims. Benedict sought to focus on doctrinal clarity and on institutional discipline. He appointed commissions, issued directives, and in some cases sought to encourage cooperation with civil authorities. Yet institutional inertia, coupled with entrenched networks that resisted oversight, meant that reformers within the Vatican often felt outmaneuvered. The VatiLeaks episode, when Paolo Gabrielli, a papal butler, took confidential documents out of the papal apartments and leaked them to journalists, pulled the curtains back in an unprecedented way. The memos Gabrielli passed to the press painted a picture of infighting, alleged financial misconduct, and managerial incompetence. Reporters such as Gianluigi Nuzzi published books and articles that cataloged the leaks, and the world watched as the Vatican try a narrow legal response, an internal trial and a conviction for the theft of documents. But the public damage had been done. VatiLeaks did more than prosecute a theft. It made visible the anatomy of distrust inside the Holy See. The fallout from VatiLeaks accelerated introspection.
For Benedict, who was by temperament and vocation a proponent of institutional order, the spectacle intensified his sense of isolation. Sources inside the Vatican told of a pope who felt the strain of managing a global institution while also attending to the pastoral and doctrinal crises pressing upon him. By February 2013, Benedict surprised the world with an announcement that no living pope had made in centuries. He would resign. In his public statement, he cited failing strength and the demands of the office. For many observers, the resignation was also an admission of the limits of one papacy to reform structures that had calcified over generations. The papacy that followed would adopt a markedly different register. Jorge Mario Bergoglio arrived in Rome as Pope Francis with a biblical simplicity and an unmistakable pastoral accent. From his first gestures, choosing the name Francis, emphasizing humility, and visiting the migrants of Lampedusa, he declared a new set of priorities. Francis framed his reformist agenda not in managerial terms alone, but as a moral and spiritual reclaiming. The Church, he said, must be for the poor, the excluded, and the marginal. Yet the practical contours of change required institutional surgery, reforming Vatican finances, reconfiguring advisory bodies, and confronting both corruption and cover-up. From the start, Francis confronted resistance. The Curia's entrenched relationships and the inertia of long-standing practices meant that top-down reform required both political skill and institutional openness. Francis created the Council of Cardinals, the C9, to advise him on reform and to propose changes to the governance of the Church. He also commissioned audits and pushed for more transparent financial structures, establishing new offices and revising the role of existing bodies. The Secretariat for the Economy was reorganized. A more robust financial watchdog, the Financial Information Authority, gained powers to supervise anti-money laundering compliance. According to Vatican statements and reporting by international media, these steps represented the most ambitious attempt in decades to bring Vatican finance into line with modern standards. But reforms met setbacks. High-profile controversies continued to surface. Charges that some Vatican offices had used intermediaries to purchase real estate in London, allegations about complex transactions involving offshore companies, and internal conflicts over the pace and depth of reform. Investigative reporting by major outlets detailed transactions between secretariats, investment vehicles, and external firms, reporting that Vatican officials sometimes said was incomplete or lacking context. Some transactions were later scrutinized by Italian and international authorities. In other cases, internal Vatican reviews led to disciplinary actions or administrative restructuring.
Francis insisted that institutional reform required both transparency and accountability. His critics replied that change was uneven and that vested interests could still frustrate progress. Voices from outside and inside the Church helped shape the debate. Historians cautioned that reforms could not ignore the Vatican's unique legal status and centuries of diplomatic practice. Canon law experts warned that the Holy See's internal law interacts awkwardly with national jurisdictions, complicating efforts to prosecute wrongdoing or to cooperate with external investigators. Journalists, for their part, pushed for greater access to documents and for the prosecution of any civil crimes uncovered. Together, these voices underlined a persistent tension. Reform must be thorough enough to matter, yet it must respect the Church's theological and diplomatic particularities.
The Francis era also amplified diplomatic activism that built on, but diverged from, John Paul II's geopolitical imprint. Francis's entreaties on behalf of migrants, his public critiques of economic systems that marginalize the poor, and his symbolic interventions, such as playing a role, according to multiple diplomatic reports, in thawing relations between the United States and Cuba, brought moral claims back to the fore. Those initiatives highlighted a different kind of papal power, not the clandestine maneuvering of Cold War politics, but a moral visibility that could influence public opinion and create diplomatic openings. Yet the greater public profile did not immunize the Vatican from scandal. The sexual abuse crisis persisted as a global challenge. Nations continued to produce inquiries and verdicts that forced dioceses and the Holy See to grapple with accountability. Pope Francis took steps, issuing norms to streamline reporting of abuse to the Vatican, creating commissions for former victims, and proposing penal reforms in canon law to better define and punish abuse. Still, survivors and advocates argued that progress was too slow. They demanded clearer cooperation with civil authorities and decisive action against high-ranking officials implicated in mishandling cases. One of the defining dilemmas of the Francis papacy has been this double-front battle, reforming an opaque financial culture while simultaneously addressing deep moral failings. The Vatican cannot separate the two. Public trust is holistic. Each new revelation about money or mistreatment reverberated across the Church's pastoral mission, undermining credibility where moral authority matters most. In the midst of this, internal resistances took varied forms. Some cardinals and bishops opposed what they saw as excessive managerialism or a politicization of papal priorities. Others resisted reforms that threatened personal networks of influence or long-standing prerogatives.
At times, those conflicts became public. Leaked memos, anonymous briefings, and pointed critiques in ecclesiastical journals signaled that power struggles were not merely administrative, but theological and personal. Francis's explicit critique of a self-referential church was both a spiritual judgment and a call to dismantle entrenched privileges. Financially, the Vatican's path to modern compliance has been halting but real. It joined international anti-money laundering bodies, rewrote protocols for financial oversight, and in some cases agreed to external audits. These steps, described in Vatican communiques and confirmed by international watchdogs, were significant because they acknowledged that ecclesiastical sovereignty could not be a shield against global standards meant to prevent criminal exploitation. Yet observers also noted gaps. Effective compliance depends on personnel, on a culture that values transparency, and on robust cooperation with civil jurisdictions. Reforming law and creating offices are necessary but not sufficient. Enforcement and institutional will are equally crucial. As these reforms unfolded, new controversies emerged that tested their depth. Investigations into specific transactions, particularly high-value property purchases, raised questions about who made decisions, what advisory networks were used, and how much oversight existed. In some instances, the Vatican publicly acknowledged mistakes. In others, it defended decisions as complex and legitimate. Independent reporting and judicial inquiries in secular courts continued to fill the public record, sometimes corroborating suspicions, sometimes exonerating particular actors. The human consequences of this prolonged turmoil must not be diminished. For survivors of abuse, for parishioners who felt betrayed, and for priests who sought to serve with integrity, the institutional convulsions created wounds and opportunities alike. Some faithful, disillusioned by scandal, left the Church. Others stayed and demanded reform from within. Clergy who resisted cover-up or championed transparency often did so at personal cost. The narrative of Vatican secrets is therefore not merely about ledgers and leaks. It is about people striving for justice, redemption, and institutional renewal amid a fraught historical inheritance. Two authoritative perspectives help frame the contemporary stakes. A historian of modern Catholicism notes that the Holy See has always walked the line between spiritual mission and worldly engagement. Modernity has simply intensified the trade-offs. Institutional instruments that once worked in a smaller, more hierarchical world can become liabilities in an era of instantaneous global scrutiny. A canon law expert adds that the Vatican's internal legal structures must be reimagined to reconcile ecclesiastical autonomy with the demands of secular justice, an undertaking that requires both theological sensitivity and practical legal craftsmanship.
Both scholars stress that structural reform must be accompanied by cultural change. Transparency must become a virtue as much as a policy. At the same time, investigative journalists remind us that secrecy did not dissolve because of goodwill alone.
Leaks, court records, and independent reporting forced the Vatican to confront failures. Figures like Paolo Gabriele, though condemned for their methods, triggered conversations that otherwise might have remained private. Journalists such as Gianluigi Nuzzi and others who published leaked documents argued that public oversight was necessary when internal mechanisms faltered. Their work was controversial, accused by some of violating confidentiality and by others of serving the public interest, but it undeniably shaped public understanding and catalyzed reform debates. Looking back to our arc, from the Lateran Treaty to Francis, one sees recurrent motifs: the imperative of survival in hostile contexts, the moral compromises made in the name of protection, the seductive convenience of opaqueness, and the corrosive effect of secrecy when it shields wrongdoing. Each papacy reacted to these pressures differently. John Paul II leveraged the papacy's moral authority to shape geopolitics, while often tolerating strongmen in the Curia to maintain unity. Benedict XVI sought to restore doctrinal clarity and discipline, but encountered institutional barriers and unforeseen backlash. Francis has sought to reorient the Church toward the poor and to purge corrupt practices, but his reforms have met structural resistance and the complicating fact that the Vatican's sovereign status makes external enforcement complex. The question that remains, one that animates both ecclesiastical insiders and secular observers, is not only whether institutional reforms can be designed, but whether they can be embedded into a culture so long accustomed to discretion. Structural remedies, new oversight bodies, enhanced reporting, greater cooperation with civil authorities are necessary, but they must be accompanied by moral courage, personal accountability, and a renewed commitment to the Church's foundational purposes. There are hopeful signs. Financial oversight has improved in measurable ways. The Vatican now participates in international regulatory frameworks it once shunned. Some clerics have been held to account. New canonical and administrative norms aim to reduce impunity. Pope Francis's public emphasis on humility and service has reinvigorated spiritual conversations that transcend institutional maneuvers. Diplomatically, the Holy See remains a unique moral interlocutor, capable of convening parties and shaping humanitarian debates. Yet unresolved questions persist. Will the culture of patronage and closed networks be uprooted? Can survivors of abuse expect consistent and full justice, not just at the margins, but at the heart of ecclesiastical power?
Will the Vatican's financial reforms withstand changing personnel and political tides? And perhaps most fundamentally, can an institution that has long relied on secrecy in the name of survival become transparent without losing its capacity to operate as a sovereign moral actor? These are not merely technical inquiries. They are ethical and theological challenges. The papacy's moral authority depends on credibility. As long as opacity persists in areas where public safety and justice are at stake, credibility will remain brittle. Reforms that focus only on optics risk failing. Reforms that seek structural and cultural transformation risk provoking defensive reactions among those who benefit from the status quo. In the end, the secrets that rocked the Vatican, from the bank scandals and suspicious deaths to the leaks that exposed infighting, and from the institutional mishandling of abuse to the courageous efforts at reform, are symptoms of a deeper tension, an ancient spiritual office trying to navigate a modern world that demands both pastoral authenticity and administrative transparency. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis represent different responses to that tension, each shaped by personal history, theological priorities, and the institutional moment in which they led. What remains clear is that the story is unfinished. The Vatican's path forward will be determined not only by decrees and reorganizations, but by the daily decisions of men and women within and beyond Rome, prosecutors and journalists, survivors and advocates, cardinals and lay reformers. The stakes are both institutional and moral. A church's capacity to speak truth to power depends on its willingness to subject itself to forms of truth-telling. If this investigation has shown one thing, it is that secrecy is a double-edged sword. It can shelter the vulnerable, facilitate delicate diplomacy, and preserve the Church's independence. It can also enable abuse, corrupt finance, and a culture of impunity. The drama from John Paul II to Pope Francis is the story of how an institution has alternately wielded secrecy as sword and as shield, and of the painful process of learning that illumination, however costly, is indispensable for lasting renewal. We leave the archives open and the questions live. In the coming years, further documents will surface, court files will clarify murky transactions, and reform efforts will either consolidate or stall. The Vatican will continue to both a spiritual center and a political actor, and so long as power and money intersect, the possibility of scandal will remain. The challenge for those who care about the Church, believers and secular citizens alike, is to press for transparency that protects the weak, fosters justice, and restores moral authority. If this investigation helped you see the Vatican's modern history with greater clarity, subscribe to the channel. We publish new long-form investigations and historical deep dives regularly.
Share your thoughts below. What do you believe are the most urgent reforms the Vatican must pursue? If you want to follow this investigation into specific episodes, the Banco Ambrosiano trials, Vatileaks documents, and the London property transactions, we have full-length deep dives and archival analyses you can watch next. Join the conversation. The story of power, secrecy, and reform in one of the world's oldest institutions is, for now, still being written.